Welcome to the second lecture in the Public Health series. In this lecture, we will be examining the Great Plague, including the measures that the government put in place to prevent its spread, before comparing it to the Black Death. This lecture will be split into 3 parts. In the first section, we will examine how the Great Plague spread. Then we will examine the measures that the government put into place to prevent the spread of the Great Plague. We will then draw up a comparison between the Great Plague and the earlier version of the same disease, the Black Death. Following the Black Death of the 14th century, both the bubonic and pneumonic versions of plague remained endemic across England. Endemic simply means that it still existed and people continued to die from the disease, but not at such a ferocious rate. However, across England, there were different points when a city would face an epidemic. For example, both Leicester and York suffered an epidemic of plague during the Renaissance age, which resulted in around 20% of its citizens dying. The Great Plague took place during the hot summer of 1665. It began in London, but quickly spread across the country, because lockdown measures were not introduced quickly enough. Within the space of 3 months, it killed approximately 100,000 people in London alone, which constituted 1/5 of the city's population. The Great Plague was a mixture of both the bubonic and pneumonic plague. The incubation period of the plague was between 2 and 8 days, during which the victims would not show any symptoms. This meant they could skip town and take the plague elsewhere before the authorities could force them into quarantine. After the incubation period, victims would develop a fever, nausea, or vomiting. For the pneumonic plague, the disease would attack their lungs, so the victim would suffer a hacking cough and eventually cough up lung tissue. In contrast, the bubonic plague had the iconic buboes, which attacked the lymph nodes, causing huge boils. By the 17th century, people had moved away from believing some of the more outlandish causes of plague, such as movement of the planets and earthquakes. However, it was still a very religious society, and so people still saw it as a punishment from God. Furthermore, they understood that it was contagious, and so could be passed to members of your family or community. This meant there were more quarantine measures. The most prominent theory for the cause of plague was miasma, or foul-smelling air. This led to some local authorities burning fires in the street so to ward off the smell. It also led to plague doctors stuffing their masks with poses of sweet-smelling herbs. This is a woodcut cartoon created in 1665 that shows the impact of the Great Plague on London. You can see the factor of religion and superstition at play, because the hand of God is pointing down at the skeleton and coffins. This shows there was still a connection between God's divine judgment and the plague. The largest building on the skyline of the town is the church, the subtle hint that everyone should attend church and pray for mercy. You can see a local militia standing guard outside the town, so to prevent citizens from leaving or entering. These were watchmen and paid about a penny a day for the service. You see plague victims lying by the side of the road. This is likely an exaggeration. The local authorities would move them to somewhere for quarantine in order to prevent the spread of the plague. You see that one victim has red spots on their chest. This could be the buboes of the bubonic plague. The woodcut was made during the summer of 1665. By this point, there were several printing houses in London who would publish pamphlets to share important news. This woodcut was likely distributed to those living in the surrounding areas to warn them that London was suffering from a plague epidemic. It was designed to warn citizens to therefore not travel to London, or receive visitors who have travelled from London. There are only a few simple written phrases, whilst the image is highly visual. This is because England still had a largely illiterate society, and so needed visual images to understand the message. Let's now examine the regulations that were put in place by the government. These were much more sophisticated than those that were put in place during the Black Death, showing genuine progress in the development of public health. However, some of these regulations were very difficult to enforce, whilst others did more harm than good. The government hired people in the roles of searcher and watchman. For a penny a day, it was their job to contain the spread of plague. Searchers were responsible for inspecting the corpse of a victim. If they were a confirmed case of plague, the members of the family were then bolted into the house for 40 days. It was then the watchman's job to watch over the house to ensure nobody tried to escape quarantine. Both victims and their healthy family members were bolted up in their house. The watchman would then bolt the doors and draw a huge red cross on the door with the phrase "Lord hath mercy." Whilst this had a religious undertone, it provided the neighbors with a clear warning and prevented victims from trying to escape. In order to prevent the spread of plague from a corpse to a healthy citizen, the government introduced laws whereby plague victims could only be buried at night. Undertakers would take a cart around the streets and collect the dead, then transport them to a burial ground outside the city walls and place them in a mass grave that was at least 6 feet deep. This would have been very distressing for the families, who could not give their loved one a proper funeral, but it would have helped to stop healthy citizens from catching the plague. The government also banned public gatherings. Taverns and theatres were forced to close and entertainers were banned from travelling from place to place. This is clear evidence that they did understand that the plague was contagious, and that large gatherings would help it to spread. However, one measure that really did not work was the massacre of cats and dogs. This is because the government believed they were helping the plague to spread across London. Members of the public were paid a penny for every cat or dog they could catch and kill. This, of course, only got rid of the natural predators of rats. It shows they were beginning to get closer to the true cause, since they were beginning to understand that a disease could travel on an animal, but they unfortunately picked the wrong type of animal to target. Let's now compare the Black Death to the Great Plague. Firstly, it is important to remember that they are not the same thing. They are the same disease, plague, but two separate epidemics that occurred 300 years apart. The Black Death spread from China and swept across the whole of Europe, killing a third of the population over a period of 3 years. In contrast, the Great Plague impacted only England and lasted for only a summer. Despite this, there are some remarkable similarities, which can be used as evidence for stagnation in both public health and the fight against disease. The first key similarity was that towns were more badly affected than the countryside. Both epidemics also broke out in the poorest areas of the town first. This is because plague spread in overcrowded, underventilated, dirty conditions, especially those with poor waste disposal. Just think about the places you were most likely to come across rats, or a place where you would not wish to stand next to someone who was suffering from a bad cold. The poor also could not skip town as easily as the rich, because they did not have the financial means. This meant they were often the first ones to be forced into quarantine by government officials. The most important similarity was the believed causes of disease. In both cases, people believed it was a punishment from God, though this was a less popular theory during the Great Plague. Miasma was also a popular theory for both epidemics, though more popular for the Great Plague. Most importantly, in both cases, people were a long way from understanding the true cause of the disease. This is because powerful microscopes were not invented until the beginning of the 19th century, and Louis Pasteur did not arrive at germ theory until 1861. Let's now return to the overarching question of how similar was the Great Plague to the Black Death? Firstly, it is worth remembering that they were both violent outbreaks of the same disease, but whilst the Black Death occurred in the medieval age, the Great Plague occurred during the Renaissance. During the Great Plague, more regulations were put in place to control the spread of the plague. This included hiring people into the positions of searchers and watchmen, but it also involved futile measures like burning fires in the streets and killing all the cats and dogs. Therefore, whilst some progress had been made in the public health measures to try and control the spread of plague by the 17th century, it was still a very deadly disease. The main reason for this is that they did not yet understand germ theory, so they could not create a vaccine to prevent people from catching the plague, or an antibiotic to act as a cure. Thank you for watching. Please tune into the next lecture in the series to learn about the most deadly disease of the industrial age, cholera, and how Edwin Chadwick and John Snow worked to overcome the public health problems associated with cholera.